Hey everybody, this is Mike Oppenheim, and you are listening to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. This week we have David Ross on the podcast. He's a 2009 convert to Catholicism from atheistic Satanism. In 2016, he launched Catholic Versus podcast, where he interviews guests of all walks of life in order to share various perspectives on faith and philosophy. And I was very fortunate to be a guest on his show, and I loved it. And so I begged him to come on the podcast, and luckily it didn't take much begging. He was in. But anyway, he lives in Montreal, Quebec, which is in Canada, in case you didn't know that, which would be weird. And he also has a beautiful wife named Anna. And they have 5 wonderful houseplants who shall remain unnamed to protect their identities. And please check the notes for a direct link to his podcast, and please become a subscriber and a listener. So anyway, without any further delays, here is David. How are you doing, David?
Yeah, well, it's great to meet you on my podcast. And I'm very grateful that you invited me onto your podcast. And looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Awesome. Well, hopefully I will say very little and you'll say a lot, because I want to pick your brain about what is a pretty bold move in 2 different directions. It's a bold move to atheistic Satanism in my belief system, and it's also a bold move into Catholicism. And what I mean by bold is just that these are religious faiths that do have like a real mission statement, whereas if someone's agnostic, for example, they're just kind of saying, I'm not sure, I'm waiting for more evidence and stuff like that. So before I start to pick your brain about both of those religious decisions in your life, we always ask our guests, how old are you, where were you, where did you grow up, and what generation, if any, do you consider yourself a member of?
I'm 53 years old. I was raised in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And I'm definitely Gen X all the way.
Awesome. Very cool. And what do you think, as a Canadian, and with all the years you've seen America and Canada coexist, what is kind of your philosophy on like what makes someone who's Canadian different from an American when you're someone who's not from either country? Like if a Brit or an Australian were to meet you and meet I, what would be like something you think they would notice?
Yeah, well, we're supposed to be the polite, nice country, very neutral and friendly and always apologizing. But that's less and less the case. And today, I'm sort of disappointed a little bit in the way our country is going. But I don't want to get too deep into the weeds there with politics. But we used to be seen a little bit more innocent and less so today. But I'm still happy to be Canadian. I'm still proud of the Canadian people. The government and the different regimes, that's a different question always.
Yeah. No, that's a great way to put it. And we don't get into politics on the show, but we always, just let people express their philosophy. But I do think it's important because we've interviewed people from, I think, like 20-something countries now that, you're not a reflection of your government, and your government is not really a reflection of you. People like to think it is, but, I certainly live in a country where I've seen many representations in government that don't necessarily reflect me. And of a similar kind of question, how different is it to live in Quebec and especially in Montreal, where French is prominently spoken, coming from Toronto?
Well, I was born and raised in Anglo Ontario, so I was attracted to the province of Quebec and Montreal in particular because of the different relationship with work and with money. It's a lot more laid back here, more of a quality of life cafe culture, or at least it used to be. Much to the chagrin of my conservative friends, I'm pro-immigration. I like having different cultures around, and I'm very happy with Montreal for the most part. But if you have any sort of motorized vehicle here, you're going to go through a lot of repairs because the roads are worse than third world conditions.
Well, it's really funny. I've only been to Montreal once, and I actually vividly remember hating the roads there. That's funny. I lived in Ithaca, New York for 2 years, so I drove up there once, and it was so beautiful, though. Oh my God, such a beautiful city. And are you fluent in French now, or are you always fluent?
My French is not great, but I work in French. I speak and communicate in French all day, every day at work. So it's a sort of an involuntary penance that I do. Hopefully it will win me some air mile points to go to heaven, because it's very painful dealing with French. But I'm an Anglophone, and I love all languages. French is not my first choice for languages, though. It's very complicated and needlessly so, I would say.
Wow, that's really interesting. And your wife, is she from Montreal? Did you guys meet up there, or is she also an Anglophone?
No, she's also Anglophone from Ontario. She went to, or I met her when I was at university in her hometown of Kitchener-Waterloo, and she did an undergraduate in French literature, and her French is kind of like mine. It's not perfect, but she can get by too. And she actually studied in the south of France for at least one semester.
Oh, cool.
And so she, she's at home here too in Quebec.
Cool. Very cool. Well, that's interesting. I know it's kind of like maybe to you kind of boring, banal questions, but for me, it's like fascinating because we have dialect cultures in America, but we don't have language groups. So it's a totally different ballgame. And then kind of moving into the focus of the podcast, which is more about philosophy and religion and metaphysics. Were you raised atheistic Satanism? Were you raised non-denominational? What was like your parents' philosophy that they tried or at least gave to you?
Yeah, I don't think anyone's raised explicitly atheistic Satanist. I mean, there are a few wackos out there that would do that, but I think the dominant religion of the world is atheistic Satanism. That's just my personal hunch. Even people in the pews at whatever religion of choice you go to, a lot of them are atheistic Satanists at heart because they adhere to the teachings of atheistic Satanism, which have nothing to do with God or Satan. It has to do with self-love, self-will, will to power, and an exaltation of reason, science, sort of false logos, if you will. And so it's a very, very popular religion, but most people won't admit to it. I admitted to it because I went down the rabbit hole of philosophy. No, I was raised in a loosely Protestant Christian home that was, we went to church on Sunday most of the time, and I really enjoyed that, going to, very liberal Protestant churches, different denominations, the United Church of Canada, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans. We jumped around, as a lot of non-Catholics tend to do. And, there was prayer at meals, there was prayer before bed. So there was definitely a Christian culture, a Christian element to it. But I wouldn't say that it dominated or that it was really terribly front and center. I can't speak for anyone else in the family, but for me, I loved it until I lost my faith at age 14 and became an atheist. I loved going to church, but I think it was maybe a little bit of a loose cultural thing. And I'm sure my parents believe something, but I'm not exactly sure what they believe and how thoroughly they've examined their particular faith,
Yeah, sure. And what exactly, if anything, exactly happened at 14? Like, what was there a major something?
Puberty.
Okay, cool.
Puberty, the hormones, noticing women and stuff like that, young women, obviously.
Yeah.
At that age. And accidentally discovering pornography, which is, I consider a satanic and very evil blight on society. But what can you do? I mean, that was in 1984. I turned 14. It was a much more innocent time. Like today, kids have access to so much pornography on their cell phones. It really is devastating. So I thank God that I was born in 1970, but still, that was the beginning of my life of sin, a dark period. And I don't know if it's coincidence or not, but right when I hit puberty, I had a beautiful dream about Jesus, and he waved goodbye to me, and I woke up and I had lost my faith in him and in God the Father and the Holy Spirit, and I was an atheist. And I knew it was counterintuitive, but I just said, well, that's what's happening. I can't pretend to have the faith anymore. I've lost it. So, and then at age 39, I came back and to philosophy. And through going deeper and darker into atheism and atheistic Satanism and hard solipsism, I ended up reading, of all things, René Descartes, and came back to God. And I got the faith again. That's
really cool, and that's really interesting. And there's a lot of years between 14 and 39, so I might circle back and have you get more into it. The questions that are burning in my mind, though, because I think for our audience, it would be very fair if you could just I'll let them work out atheism, and maybe I'll even ask you to define that, but can you just define Satanism the way you're going to use it the rest of the podcast? So I don't care if there's a larger group that disagrees with you, but when you refer to that term, what exactly is the tenet/belief system for that?
Well, I've already defined it. It's the self-love, self-will, my will be done.
Okay.
The famous Christian prayer that our Lord taught us, it's the Lord's Prayer. and we say, "Thy will be done, God." And the Satanist prayer is the inverse of that: "My will be done."
Okay.
That's Satanism. Oh, that's it. That's atheistic Satanism. And there's no belief in God. From an atheistic perspective, it's mumbo jumbo. All of religion is a fantasy. There's only logic, reason, science. And so it's a very cold and clinical, rationalistic, deterministic worldview, atheistic Satanism. So it's about me, and it's about truth and reason, and that's the supreme irony of atheistic Satanism, is that the adherents think that they are smart, and they think that they're pursuing the truth, and there's absolutely no philosophical basis for any of their beliefs. Even the sense perceptions that they use to do empirical science, there's no philosophical basis for belief in these alleged sense perceptions. So I discovered all of this, through the course of time. I escaped from my hard solipsism, and so I was able to embrace the real world, the other, and the sense perceptions. They are real. They do correspond to a physical reality that we call creation. That's the Christian perspective. We have God, the creator, and then we have creation. So that's sort of Cole's Notes version of comparing and contrasting atheistic Satanism with the Christian worldview.
Yeah, and I think the reason I asked you to isolate atheistic from Satanism, there's two reasons, and thank you, your definition was wonderful, so I'm not pressing you about it. It's more that, to explain from my end, I know atheism very well because a ton of people I grew up with in the Bay Area of California call themselves atheists, but I've never, as a younger person, met someone who called themselves a Satanist, for example. And then the other thing that's confusing is you said it's not at all about God, it's the denial of God, but the word Satan, the name Satan, to me is like a name that is almost like an antonym to God. So that's where, for me, it was throwing me off. Why, if you know, why did they pick, whoever it is, pick Satan as a word? Why not call it like hedonism or some other term that's more about my will?
Well, because one of the hobbies of the Satanists is to poke and prod and make fun of and ridicule Christ and his church. Like that's one of the main things, is like to do theatrical nonsense, sort of like the Dada school of art, where we undermine things through humor and absurdity. So we take on the name Satanism as a goad to prod the Christian. Mainly, that's the main thing. It's to look down our nose at these fools who believe these ancient pagan myths that have been elevated to the state of so-called religion. So that's the Satanistic edge, sort of an edgy sense of humor, and we're going to mock and ridicule. That's I fully embraced that. I thought that was great.
Yeah, you're really doing a great job explaining this, and I love hearing it. So then, now that, I'm not going to say you're on the other side, because that's not true, but now that you're on a side that thinks that side is arrogant, do you feel or notice an arrogance in Catholicism that's like equally oppressive of that philosophy, or how do you kind of like untangle those odds and ends?
Well, sadly, I've got a foot in both camps. I'm not fully Christian. I'm still partly Satanistic. That's the problem. Because to be fully Christian would mean, to be a saint and to be completely detached from the world and from sin. And I regret to admit that I do love the world. I love pleasure. I love, I can't say that I love sin, but I do fall into sin. And that's the struggle. That's the Christian struggle, is to liberate ourselves from that worldliness, from that Satanistic element that we all have. And I'm ready, willing, and able to admit it. I can see it. And I just went to confession this morning. I confessed my sins, and I ask Christ to give me the grace, not only forgiveness, but the grace, the power to overcome concupiscence, this desire to be worldly, to take pleasure, and to put the creature above the creator, which is what sin always is at root. And, the sin of Satanism is putting the self above the creator. And God's name is I am. So, I mean, when you put yourself above the creator, you are saying, in essence, I am. And you're making yourself a God. And so that's why I say that hard solipsism, or even a soft solipsism, or different forms of Satanism, atheistic Satanism, they are very prevalent. And I openly admit that I've got a foot in both camps. And the goal, as a young Christian here, I've been Christian since 2009, and the goal, the ongoing struggle, is to be less and less of a Satanist and more of a Christian. And you'll know I've arrived when I walk into a room and everyone's turning their heads and coming to me to be healed, and it's basking in the glory of my saintliness. So I'm not there yet. It's a great understatement to say I'm not quite there yet.
That's cool. I really like your attitude. I liked it on your podcast, and so I wanted to have you on. But it's really fun to hear you have more time and more of a runway to speak. So thank you. I'm fascinated by this. All right, my next question is a little weird, but I think it'll make sense to you. What is harder for your family to deal with? You being a Catholic or you being a atheistic Satanist?
Catholic, for sure.
Okay.
For sure.
I think that would surprise a lot of people. That's what.
Yeah, well, it's just way more. It's way more countercultural. Mm-hmm. Because, like I said, I mean, this is not to, I'm not being glib here, but it is very popular for people to put themselves first a lot of the time, not 100% of the time, but a lot of the time, to be selfish and to think of their own needs and the pleasures and these sorts of things. And that's normal. And if you want to read the history of the saints, you're going to see that the saints annoy the regular people. And even Socrates, who I consider sort of a proto-saint, Socrates annoyed everyone with his rigorous adherence to the truth as he saw it. Mm-hmm. And, they killed him. They killed him for his shocking and annoying love of the truth. His nickname was the Gadfly because he annoyed everyone.
Yeah.
And so I'm not trying to be annoying. But it is very annoying being a Christian. To the extent that you're Christian, you will annoy people. And to a certain extent, you have to be prepared to suffer and die as Christ did. And so that's another part of the faith.
That's really, really interesting. And there's a peculiar, unexpected humility that you have that I don't necessarily, I'm going to be very careful with how I word this. People who are brought up Catholic and never broke don't seem to have that, and you do. And I'm saying seem to because I don't know enough to really stereotype a whole group. I met a lot of Catholic people when I went to college. And I'm from the West Coast where there's very few Catholics. And do you, does it come between you and your wife, or is she also Catholic?
No, she's extremely anti-Catholic. She is rabidly anti-Catholic, and she thinks the Pope is the Antichrist and these sorts of things. She was raised culture. I don't want to talk too much about her because I talk about her, but in public. But I'll just say that she was raised culturally Greek Orthodox, and she's very proud of that culture, and she thinks that's the one true religion, but she doesn't practice it, which is, I think, a little bit hypocritical. But in any case, she hates the Catholic Church, and there's a cultural hatred of the Catholic Church from the Eastern Orthodox side generally.
I am familiar.
It's not always the case, but there is a cultural antagonism there. So yeah, it's a big challenge. That's another one of my crosses that I have to bear. But I don't want to paint a pity party here. I mean, we love each other and we have a good time hanging out. We love each other, so it's not a big problem, but it does flare up occasionally.
No, and it's interesting because I asked because my wife was raised Jewish and is Jewish, and I was raised like sorta like maybe Jewish. It's like the nicest way I could explain it, but very like my parents are much more into meditation and Eastern philosophy than they are into Judaism. So I did not get bar mitzvah. I don't consider myself Jewish in a religious sense. And so this also creates conflict between us, and also not with her family, but her family is much more Jewish. So it's always interesting to me to ask people, because I think you should be able to have a different faith than your spouse and your family and even your children. So, and your houseplants, if that applies to you. What would you say like you said, Rene Descartes, like really pushed you, but like what pushed you to push into philosophy? Like what was going on in your life that made you think like, maybe I should dive deeper into philosophy?
Hey everyone, if you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks.
Yeah, I've always been philosophically minded. Like, just about the time I lost my faith, I started reading Western philosophy. Mm-hmm. And it's been sort of an on-again, off-again love affair with the history of Western philosophy in overview, to sort of do a smattering of readings from chronologically, through the Golden Age, Plato and Aristotle, and all the way through up until I reached Rene Descartes. That's basically the 25 years of atheism was, pursuing the love of truth in a very slipshod, on again, off again way. And I would go through periods where I would do intensive reading, putting together and falling into rabbit holes. And the German idealism is one of the ones I always talk about, where I sort of went deep into that, and so, because I'm a Platonist at heart, I really am a Platonist at heart. And so there's a whole Platonist school of Catholicism, which I don't fully buy into because I reject certain parts of Platonism. But, there is a Platonist school, and I do have those leanings. And there's the Aristotle, which sort of dominates today. And I just sort of try to take the good from both camps. But in my heart of hearts, I really am a Platonist. And for your listeners, just to roughly understand what the difference is, you could make a cartoon caricature of it where Plato has his head in the clouds with his idealism and the world of ideas, and the forms of the forms and these sorts of things, and perfection and the one, and there's sort of a divine oneness. And the Aristotelian approach is a little bit more empirical, bottom up, a posteriori, whereas Plato is more a priori. So that's just a real rough sketch of the differences. But there are two schools in Catholicism, and they work together, complement each other, and but they do conflict and disagree on certain finer details of theology, which is interesting, but I don't think terribly important. Mm-hmm. But if that's the sort of thing you're into, it definitely makes for some interesting reading.
Cool. All right. Well, I think this is the best time now to finally ask you what normally I ask guests a lot earlier in the podcast, but I needed to ask you a lot of questions because you've zigged and you've zagged and you're 1 foot in two camps and you're just very eloquent and you describe everything well. So what exactly do you think is going to happen to you when you die as of today? The recording date is October 22nd, 2023.
Well, there's the separation of the soul from the physical body. That's the technical definition of death. And the soul is judged in a particular judgment. So I meet the Lord, and it's shown to me the reality of the use and abuse of my free will. Mm-hmm. And so that's hopefully not going to be too painful, because hopefully I'm going to end up in heaven, not in hell. But those are the two outcomes that are possible. I will either be designated for heaven or for hell. And on the way to heaven, if I'm destined for heaven, because of the way that I used my free will and the way I repented of my abuses of free will, if God willing I make it to heaven, I may probably have to go through purgatory, which is a purification, and then I can be with God, because nothing impure can stand before God. So heaven is being with God, entering into the life of the Trinity. God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so heaven is remaining who I am, and I'll be my soul will be reunited at the general judgment once the end of time comes, because we believe that there's a beginning in time and there's an end in time. And when the end of time comes, then there's a general judgment, and then we get reunited with our bodies. And we enjoy a new heaven, a new earth, and we see our families and friends who are in heaven. And we'll even see those, I guess, who are down in hell, unfortunately. And we will not be saddened by that, because we will understand the justice of God, the mercy of God, and everything will be just well ordered, and we'll understand how those who did say no to God's graces ended up in hell. So there's going to be no tears, there's going to be no sadness, no frustration, and no temptation in heaven. There will also be no faith and no hope in heaven, because everything will be fulfilled. So it will just be love. And as St. Paul said, there's faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love, because love is.
Cool.
So that's what death is for me. And the four last things are death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And the goal is to go to heaven and to avoid hell.
Cool. I really like the way you explained it. There are people who would say, like, that sounds really boring, just being, like, vast in love and all that. I'm not asking that at all. That's not where my brain is going. But what I am curious about is who is going to experience this? Is it you, like David? Like, your body is a body. So is your brain part of your body, or is your brain part of your soul, or neither?
Yeah, the brain is part of your body, and your mind is not your brain.
Okay.
Your brain is, reacting to your mind, obviously. The same way that the pedals on a bicycle move when my legs move the pedals. It's not the pedals moving my legs, it's my legs moving the pedals. So My legs will be the mind, and the pedals will be the synapses in the brain. Okay, so in this analogy, so yeah, we're going to get a spiritualized body that will resemble that of Adam and Eve pre-fall, like they fell from grace. But before they fell from grace, they were able to move at the speed of thought, and pass through if they wanted to, and they were free from concupiscence. They had certain gifts that they lost at the fall. And so today we have, the wars in the Middle East and in Russia, Ukraine. We've got people torturing each other and being mean to each other and these sorts of things because our parents fell and they fell from grace. So there are many graces that they lost. And so we're going to have those in heaven and probably more. And, it's outside of time because time has a beginning and an end. And at the end of time, that's it. There's no more space-time. We're in eternity. But we will still have access to the spatio-temporal. It's just that four-dimensional object that we call space-time has served its purpose. Now we are at a higher level. And so I will be David. I will have my personality, but I will not have the bad parts, the selfishness and all the nasty stuff that I'm struggling with now as a Christian.
Wow. I mean, it's just really interesting because I'm not in either of your camps, but I'm totally in your camp. So it's just interesting. It's fascinating. I'm 42 and I'm in a similar journey. The only thing that never made sense to me is just okay, if I sin according to the Catholic faith, I'm talking within one context. If I sin 90% of my life, but then I'm deeply atoning and apologetic and truly not contrived, but genuinely sorry, is that okay? Is that enough? Or is there an actual sorry, you got to pay more, now I'm moving to a different terminology, but karma points, now you sorry, but you've got to absolve for these sins more.
Yeah, karma is real. Karma is very real. Karma is cause and effect. And when you are part of a machine and you stick your wrench into the wheels, you're doing damage. I mean, that's reality. So that damage has consequences, and you got to pay, and your friends and family have to pay because you messed up. That's what sin is. That's why we don't like sin, because it messes up the great, elegant creation that was supposed to be well ordered. But our first parents fell, and now things are out of whack. And so, like I said, we have war, disease, and famine, all these natural disasters and everything else. And there's original sin, that's one thing. And then there's you with your actual sin. You're messing things up even further. And you don't need to, but you're bound to because, you're born into this sick world and you're weak and you're dim of wit like the rest of us. So, if we have the grace to be a great saint, then we'll sin less. We'll still sin, but we'll sin less. And we say that the Blessed Virgin Mary was conceived without original sin, and that she was protected from sinning even as the smallest of sins by a special grace in view of the merits of Jesus Christ. But that's just one example. That's an extreme exception. The rest of the saints were sinners. They were sinning, and even Mary is a sinner, but she was just protected from sinning by special grace. So you can repent, and you should repent, and you will repent, hopefully. And I'm sure you do repent in your own way every day. You hurt your wife's feelings, and then you apologize, and it's just natural, right? But you need the supernatural virtues of faith, hope, and love to go to heaven. So that's a gift of God that you have to say yes to eventually. And but everyone can be saved. But when you get forgiven, there's still those consequences because this great organism, this great creation, is groaning under the sin, the original sin, and then our actual sins, and so you got to pay for that. Yeah, with karma, that's 100% true. But there's also a way to reduce that. What we call we don't actually technically call it karma, but I just like using that word because it borrows from the East, and it's nice to reunite the ideas. But the thing is that you can reduce the temporal punishment due to sin. And you can do that by what's called indulgences, and they're very controversial. You think about Luther, how he revolted against the abuses of the indulgences, but the indulgences themselves are a good, and every good is subject to abuses. So if you look into the history of the Reformation, you'll see the real story about indulgences. And I strive to get indulgences all day, every day, because I want to reduce that karma, those temporal punishments which are due to sin.
Wow, this was really fascinating. So it's cool because, like I said, you have a sense of humility and a sense of awareness of like, I have a lot of work to do, I have things to do, but I also like your confidence or faith, whatever term you prefer. To me, they're both similar and they matter. And I like, especially that you dabbled into mentioning all the wars and stuff, because I think, I don't know when this is going to be released, but right now, for the first time in about 10 years, I'm hearing people talk about war constantly, and, it seems to be cyclical. You're 52, I'm 42. Like, it's not the first time or the last time probably, but it is nice that you relate it to the bigger picture, because I think that's a lot of people's hang up with religions is they're like, well, this is BS and this isn't, but I like how you're seeing like this much larger picture, which I also see. And again, I see it from a different perspective, like call it Schrodinger's cat or something else, but it doesn't matter. I'm still seeing this interconnectivity and what you and I have been talking about. As we draw to a close here, I always let my guests have the floor and kind of like say what they want to say. But I do want to ask you, if it applies to you, do you believe in like proselytizing? Like, is it good for you to go out of your way to try to get people to convert, or do you just live and let live?
Well, we're supposed to preach the gospel at all times and use words if necessary. That's what St. Francis of Assisi said. So remember I told you the little fantasy image of where I become more and more Christian to the point where I actually walk into a room and everyone's just, you can hear the angels singing and everyone's getting healed and that sort of thing. That's like a cartoon caricature of it. But that, we can read the history of the saints. We can see how powerful it is to be pure and holy. So that's really, if I'm going to convert someone, I have to be holy. And I'm not doing a very good job of that. So for me to bash you over the head with Bible quotes or Catholic dogmas or whatever, it's going to be, first of all, it's going to be prideful and it's not going to really work. So St. Paul says in the Bible somewhere that if you use reason and arguments to convert someone, you're not converting them to religion, you're converting them to reason and arguments, which is what I described Satanism as. Mm-hmm. Satanism is reason and arguments. So it's all about holiness. And so, I mean, if you can save one soul with your holiness, be instrumental in the grace of God to save one soul by your holiness, then that covers a multitude of sins. And so, I think you'll be saved if you can do that. And it sounds like a small thing, but really, it's very daunting. If you know yourself, if you look into your heart and see the darkness that's there and the selfishness, you realize that to be holy enough to influence one other soul, even if it's your beloved spouse or mother or father, whatever, or child, it's a big ask, it's a big task, and it's, as Jesus said, it's impossible for man, but with God, nothing's impossible. So that's why we have to be humble. We have to say everything good is a gift from God. What do we have that we've not received? And if you've received it, why are you boasting? So it's all about humility and holiness. And we should preach always using our actions, not necessarily words. Now, having said that, I'm also into philosophy and Twitter battles and stuff like that. It is fun to knock around ideas. It's fun to play with ideas, and I like to be right. I like to win arguments, as we all do. But we just need to keep it in a proper perspective and love the person and make the person the end and not a means to an end. So I bear that in mind. If I'm having fun arguing with a fellow Christian of another worldview, or like a Protestant or an Orthodox, I have to keep that in mind, that, this is fun arguing, but it's not really the main thing. It's not really the Christian thing.
Wow, that was such a great answer, David. Thank you so much. Everyone, again, I really encourage you. Obviously, you like philosophy, and obviously, you like metaphysics. You're listening to the Coffin Talk podcast. You're also probably a subscriber to the Casual Casuist, the essays I write, which are always philosophical and or metaphysical. So please check out the CBS podcast, Catholic Versus. It's interesting, and you've heard David talk, and he's a great host. And something, by the way, just to compliment you, do a great job with listening to your guests and giving them a lot of time in the floor. So I hope I did the same for you today, and it was a total pleasure to walk through your life. And for everyone listening at home, the number one way to support the show is to head over to mikeyop.com. That's MIKEYOPP.com, and sign up for the weekly essay. And we appreciate you listening. And please check out David's podcast. It'll be in the notes. Again, there'll be a link and everything for you. And David, thank you for coming on the show. And to everyone listening, my name is Mike Oppenheim. You have been listening to Coffin Talk, and we will see you soon.